Hey everybody, this is James from TeaDB. I am bringing you a question and answer Inbetweenisode. Let's get going. So people have sent in a lot of questions, so maybe we'll make this a regular thing. I definitely could not get to all the questions I wanted to answer, but I've tossed a bunch of them into a Google Doc. We are going to start. So first, Nathan asks, who are some of your favorite vendors for aged oolongs? What should you look for when shopping for aged oolongs, since there isn't any branding like Pu'erh? So there are people that are much better at judging the leaves and things like that than I am, as far as aged oolongs and their pictures. But you should probably look for something that's brewing red or very close to red. That would imply that it's sort of the right color profile. It's only really one way to know for sure, and that is to try the teas. And from my experience, the West is for aged oolongs. You can definitely get some okay examples. I would recommend Floating Leaves. Occasionally has a few teas that are pretty good. Generally vendors that are closely connected with Taiwan and hopefully go there now and then would be more likely to have the real deal. Yong Ching Hao through Emmett sometimes has some okay teas. Camellia sinensis has a lot. I wouldn't say that they're ever I've been blown away by their aged oolong selections, but they do have a bunch if you do just want to sample. At Everlasting Teas, I've also had some pretty good aged Baojong. I know that Sammy has some pretty good connections over in Pinglin over there. So I guess I would sort of start with those, and usually most of these vendors, with maybe the exception of Camellia sinensis, only have maybe 2 or 3 examples. So it's not a tea that any vendor is like a specialist or super well stocked in. All right, so Jefferson C says, what type of teas do you personally feel the most chi from? Aged white does it for me. For me, chi is something I usually don't get, even for teas that I would say for like 90% of the 80% of the teas I just don't get any chi from. Teas that I do, puer would probably be the most common, and I think that's mainly a product of the source material. I certainly don't get it from most puer, and it's almost always sheng puer. I just about never get it from ripe. So I guess sheng puer, sometimes wui oolongs, and I think in those cases it has to do with the source material as well, just being really good. All right, so here is one on water, and there were a lot of questions on puer, so I'm going to do the non-puer questions first. He says, I've recently been experimenting with different water types, mostly TDS for my puer. So far, I've had the most success with filtered water for young sheng, spring water around 70 TDS for older sheng and show. Do you have any water preferences for certain types or know of a good reference point to learn about it? I've already read all of Marshall's posts about water. There was some interesting activity on water, I think by Max on the Pu'erh Tea Club. He had been doing some experiments. He was based out in Japan, and he actually found that Volvic, which is sort of like one of the somewhat more well-known brands for water that is available pretty widely. Although oddly enough, I've had a hard time finding it here in the Pacific Northwest. He found that they were actually different in Japan versus other parts of the world. But anyways, to this question, I have not done extensive testing, but what I do know and trust is that people tend to think that lower TDS water, so 85 or lower, is better for older teas, older sheng specifically, and I think it really brings out more body to the tea. Andrew and I, Andrew, one of my tea friends, we had done experiments with an older dry stored sheng, and we tried Volvic versus Castle Rock, which is a bottled water. He found it I think from a Whole Foods or something like that in Southern California, we found that Castle Rock, which is a low TDS water, really enhanced the experience in a really nice way. So limited experience, but that's what I do know. Very interesting and vast topic overall. All right, so Noah asks, what are some less well-known sources that you get tea from? Do you have any personal connections that aren't available to the public? If so, how do you make those connections? The answer is yes, and unfortunately, most of those connections will have to remain private. And I think if you just stay around the tea scene and kind of show your passion, I think sources, more of the private sources, will eventually reveal themselves to you if you are interested and want to spend that kind of money. So yeah, I mean, I guess I don't have a ton of insight here, but if you are a passionate person about tea and are active, some people can be extremely generous in sharing their tea and their sources with you. All right, so Jeff asks, how did you and Denny first meet and get started drinking tea together? So I actually met Denny maybe 20 years ago or so. We went to middle school, the same middle school together here in the Pacific Northwest, and we met up again after college and became business partners. But and so he got into tea first, and he would go to these tea shops, and he bought some tea for the office on the company card, and I was like, what are you doing, man? And so eventually I just started drinking it, and like a year later we were filming TeaDB. So that's kind of how the tea got started. I guess one of the funny things about it is that when we were in high school, I was a fairly good Warcraft 3 player, and we used to do audio commentaries on that. I'm not sure if any are still around. I would suspect not. This is like 2003 or so, and so yeah, we did. I guess that was TeaDB before TeaDB. Jeff asks, any idea of the caffeine content of Pu'erh against other teas, and also between Sheng and Shou? I guess so. This is a good question, and there's no real way to know for sure. Buddy teas tend to have a little bit more caffeine, so if you're drinking a very tippy ripe Pu'erh, that might have a little bit more caffeine. I've heard conflicting things about if caffeine goes down as it ages. I suspect it might not be huge. I wouldn't think that a 10-year-old tea would have dramatically less caffeine than a young tea if it were the same material. Again, it's sort of hard to know for sure. Things like Huang Pian probably do have a fair amount less caffeine than sort of more average Pu'erh. Okay, any good books about tea you'd recommend? The one tea book that I always recommend, and then still just about the only one that I recommend, is Ancient Caravans and Urban Chic. It's by Zhongjing Heng. She's an anthropologist, and she kind of toured around Yiwu especially, but all over Yunnan and Hong Kong, and I think it was around 2007, so right during the bust of Pu'erh tea. Definitely worth reading, especially if you're into Pu'erh. When you're having a session alone and don't want to overdo it, what size Gaiwan teapot do you use? Typically, I'll use a 90, 95, 100 milliliter pot for my sessions for myself. I find that you want something large enough that you're not just pouring the whole time. For more sampling sessions, or if I really do want a smaller session, I'll use something that's 70 or 75 milliliters. Won't really go beneath that because I just don't really find it worth it to drink tea at that point. If you're just pouring, there's also concerns about leaf expanding. You want to have a vessel that can properly allow leaves to sort of expand. All right. For someone just getting started into Pu'erh, what is either an approachable or maybe middle of the category option to try to get a feel for a standard but good tea? So usually what I'd recommend to someone starting off with Pu'erh is to Pick one of the big vendors, Crimson Lotus Tea, White Tea, Yunnan Sourcing, etc. And then pick a ripe puer, a young raw puer, and a puer with 7 plus years of age, and try those teas. Sample a few teas from each of those categories, and just get a feel for them. It's kind of hard to pick out what is just a good tea if you don't know what you're doing. So those vendors are generally reliable, generally have good tea, and should sell each of those options. All right, so we are going into some questions on puer aging here. This is from Roberto. I actually would like to know your input on aged raw puer by years. I know there are many factors in play like storage type, but I've never seen someone make a generic list of what to expect from a raw that's freshly young raw after 2 years, 5, 7, and 10, and so on. I think your opinion on it would be quite interesting. This is true, and there are a lot of variables to keep in play here. I'd say when a raw is really freshly young, the aroma will be at its sort of most vibrant in terms of just like florals, higher notes, and things like that. You would expect as it ages that those would become a little bit more muted. So if you're really in love with top notes, floral notes, and things like that, one, you should consider what you're looking for in a puer, and it may just be worth your while to drink and buy puer as you go. And two, you probably prefer dry aged shung that's on the drier end of storage. I think after 2 years it becomes pretty difficult, depending on the tea, to taste raw puer. Sometimes this is sort of at a stage where a lot of teas will have those top notes that are really pleasant. They'll age away, but they won't be really replaced with more interesting aged flavors. So usually for me, I prefer to drink the tea fresh, like within the first year or two, and then maybe wait for 6 or 7 years and then try it. So at 7 years, you would expect it to really start to get some more age characteristics, and I think it depends a lot where it's stored. It's going to be a very different thing 7 years in somewhere relatively hot and humid like Taiwan versus somewhere like Kunming. But you would expect it to sort of develop more interesting notes. It's hard for me to know exactly how to describe how it would change, but it'll brew a little bit darker. It'll hopefully be a little bit more rounded, a little bit less sharp, hopefully smoother, things like that. Okay, this is from Philip. What are sure signs that shung will age into a remarkable tea? I once bought a tea that won awards at some expo in China. It was disgusting and undrinkable. 4 or 5 years later, I was about to throw it out, and I thought, well, I will just brew a cup to see if anything has changed. It was delicious. Now I have a little bit of it that I'm savoring for just the right time. I wondered how the people who tasted it could have known that it would turn into what it turned into, because it truly was disgusting when I first drank it. Well, that is the $1 million question, and there is no easy answer to this. And if it was that simple, puer would be a lot easier. But I think there are some signs. You would expect teas that are bitter and astringent. Hopefully that would age out. So if it has those characteristics, you might not find those pleasant early on, but it might show that it's something that will age. I think you could also run the risk of buying a tea that's too weak, too mellow. If there's not enough fuel and juice in the tea, then it may just not develop well. And I think the other thing is aftertaste. I think Huigan, I think things like sort of how it lingers, the sweetness, if there's like a really enduring sweetness in your throat, even if the tea is bitter and astringent, I think that's something to really keep in mind to see how the tea will age. If you're really attracted to those top notes, those floral notes, and this sort of goes back to an earlier question, then you should question how much you want to age that tea. If there's more to the tea than that, then absolutely. But there's no 100% sure answer. And I will say I think it's a lot easier to evaluate sort of like, I don't know, the longer term aging prospects of a tea once you're at sort of like 6 or 7 years versus drinking a tea fresh. So for me, I'm not super comfortable picking horses when they're young. I could guess, but I would feel much more comfortable once those teas have 7 years under their belt or so. This is from Koya M. Let's see. Some weeks ago, I bought a fairly big volume of Young Sheng samples from YS and Crimson. For me, this was the first time to consume a lot of young puer. I got caught in the world of puer because of mid-aged Sheng. Back to the young puer samples, while I liked most of the samples, I also had the feeling that they were very similar to each other. Furthermore, I felt that they were quite weak. That confused me. I thought that young Shengs were supposed to be quite strong and get more subtle notes in the aging process. In my experience, it was the exact opposite. I love my mid-aged Shengs, which are very powerful, fragrant, and long-lasting. The young Shengs I had so far became almost tasteless after only maybe 6 infusions. So finally, here are my questions. What teas, region, vendors can you recommend with a fairly strong punch? How do you treat young raw puer different from mid-aged raw puers? Maybe share some brewing parameter comparisons. How much can tea suffer from getting broken down to a small size sample and shipped around the globe? Is there a reason why they might taste so weak? So I guess one question I would have for Koya is what mid-aged Shengs is he comparing it to? I think mid-aged Shengs, there can be a really wide range of possibilities. Of course, there are storage considerations. You could have Sheng stored somewhere very differently, and it could be the same tea. It could turn out very differently. If he's talking about factory puer versus something like Yong Qing Hao, those are two very different beasts. He's asking, I think, what is a pretty interesting question as to like how these sorts of like more modern teas that maybe aren't as, that are maybe a little bit more palatable to the palate early on, a little bit more aromatic, a little bit more fragrant, how they'll age. And I don't know. I think some of them will be fine. But I think it's also important to keep in mind that puer has consistently, for the raw material, has risen and risen and risen. So young tea in 2018 cost much more than young tea cost in 2010. So it may actually, even though this is a little bit counterintuitive, it may be the case that the same raw material from 2010 is cheaper than it was in 2018. So that's possible. I tend to brew my tea the same way approximately, whether it's mid-aged Sheng or if it's young raw puer. And tea can certainly suffer from being broken down to a smaller sample and shipped around. It could be a reason why it tastes weak. I would think that the processing of the tea is just quite different. If you're comparing this versus something like Shaguan or a factory puer, I think those teas are just going to be inherently more in your face with their bitterness and astringency. So comparing them versus something more boutique may not be the best comparison. Again, it kind of does depend on what he is comparing it to. All right, so we have just 3 more questions. So Ben, the last 3 are all from Ben. So here we go. I am in search of an affordable, under $60 quality Sheng puer cake that is at least beginning to show age characteristics and does not taste like it was just pressed. I want something that has some woody aroma and is complex. It doesn't have to be like a $200 well-aged cake, but is there anything that might be in this category? Please list your top 10 recommendations. If you would rather not do that, can you provide some tips on what to look for so that I could find these qualities in the cake? Like, I don't know, minimum age, particular leaf source, storage location, etc. Okay, so there's a lot to sort of unpack there. Personally, I cheated on this question a little bit. I did look at this earlier, and I do have some teas that I would recommend that are available from Western vendors. I think $60 is a little bit low. I would personally just up that to $80, and I think, so that would put you at, for a standard 357 gram cake, it's around 25 cents, 20 to 25 cents per gram. So for 6-7 gram session, $1.20 or $1.40. I don't think that's outrageous. I personally like to look for teas that are at least 7+ years old. There's variability within that, of course. And I also like to look, if I'm looking at that time frame, for something that I'd like to drink immediately, for something that's probably stored in Taiwan, Munghai, somewhere that's a little bit more humid, Guangdong, etc. So a couple teas from White to Tea is, I am a fan of the 2009 Iwu that they sell. In general, am a fan of Iwu teas, so and this one's no exception. I think that one's solid. There's the 2008 Munghai from the same brand. I like this one a little bit less than that 2009 Iwu that sells for around $80. But I do think it's worth trying. And the 2005 Gaoshan Qingbing from them is also a good one. From Yunnan Sourcing, there's a lot of teas I have not tried, more recent additions. I can recommend the 2005 Big Yellow Mark. I think that's a good strong tea. That's also pretty tasty right now. And the 2005-2006 Jinglong Iwus are solid mid-aged Iwus as well. From Tea Urchin 2, I would say that you should look at their sales. They've been doing sales for some of their 2011 inaugural autumn harvest teas, and they're basically offering these teas at their older prices. So they're selling a Dingjia Zai right now for about $50 for 357 gram cake. I have not tried that tea, but I think that's probably likely to be a very good deal. What teas have been the most interesting to you and why? Are there any that you like so much that you tried to have some permanently in your stash or in your cache? I'm a sucker for mid-aged Iwus. I own a lot of mid-aged Iwus, and yes, there are some that I own a tong or maybe even two of teas that I really do enjoy. Something like the Yongqing Howling Ya would be a good example. For Pu'erh, that I plan to finish in a few months, what is the best storage method? I'd rather it not absorb surrounding odors and flavors, but it doesn't need to age any further. Great question. I think more people should be thinking in this manner rather than creating Pomodors for short-term storage. Store it in a Ziploc if you're concerned about that. Store it in 2 Ziplocs stacked together. Store it in Mylar. No need to get too crazy about it. I think something like that will be just fine for even a few years. So, yeah, I think that just about concludes this Q&A. That was the last question. So thank you to everyone for sending in questions. Hopefully I can bring on some of the others into a future question and answer episode. And I will see you all next time.